Okay, this is Block 7, The Greatest Generation, Section 7, The War in the Pacific, with the section starting the War in the Pacific, 1941 and 1942. Let's bring ourselves up to date where we were when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941. Japan, obviously, is the country in red right here in the middle. Japan had a colony in Korea, had taken over Manchuria, renamed it Manchukuo, if you remember that from earlier in the block, and had also invaded China and was fighting the Chinese in China. The Americans had main bases in the Philippines, right here, and in Hawaii, over here, while the British colonies and dependencies of India, Siam, Thailand, Malaya, Singapore, Borneo, New Guinea, and Australia. The French controlled what was known as French Indochina, today Vietnam, and Laos and Cambodia, and the Dutch here in the Dutch East Indies in orange. If you remember that Japan's goal is to seize these colonies for their natural resources, to have East Asia for the East Asians, controlled, of course, by the Japanese. They understand that they are at a strategic disadvantage against the Americans, that the Americans can produce a lot more stuff than they can. Their general strategy is to take these colonies very, very quickly, kind of form this big defensive perimeter, and then hold it against an American and British counterattack. The Japanese believe that the Western democracies are weak and they cannot stand up to the spirit, elan, discipline, and ruthlessness of Japanese soldiers. They believe that Americans and Brits cannot fight in the jungle, that Japanese can, that the Japanese can live on a few handfuls of rice a day. The Americans and the Brits cannot. So there is a belief that if Japan moves quickly, they can seize these territories, and then the Americans and the British will not have the gumption, the chutzpah, the wherewithal to actually spend that much time, money, and treasure taking them back. So Japan not only attacks Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, but it coordinates its attack on Pearl Harbor up here with a brutal and ruthless and efficient attack southward. On the 8th of December 1941, the Japanese attack and soon conquer French Indochina. Why are we erasing? I don't know. Don't erase. Draw. Red. Conquer French Indochina. They attack and conquer British Malaya. They take the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore. They attack towards British India. They attack the Philippines from several different directions. And they continue on their way and attack and take over the Dutch East Indies. So what you have, they also come out and fortify and take over all these islands in the Pacific. They defeat American forces on Wake Island. They defeat American forces on Guam Island. And what you have by the spring of 1942 is a Japanese control over a huge chunk of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Ocean. The United States is able to slow down the Japanese to an extent in the Philippines. And what we have here, let's have a look at some. No, meat, not. Meat, nope. Meat, not. Nope. This is the Japanese Zero, one of the best fighter planes in the world in the early 1940s. The Americans were able to slow down the Japanese to an extent in the Philippines. This is General Douglas MacArthur. We have seen him before. He was in charge of the whole bonus army mess in Washington in 1932. Fighting alongside Filipino troops, General Douglas MacArthur battled a fighting retreat through the Philippines Islands, through the main island of Luzon, down to the southern tip. Here's a map. What you have here, this is the city of Manila, the most important city in the Philippines, the capital city, the biggest port. MacArthur and his men retreated down this peninsula. This is the Bataan Peninsula, where 22,000 troops tried to hold on and wait for help from the United States. But with the Pacific Fleet destroyed, no help was coming. So they were fighting pretty much a hopeless action. But since it controlled the harbor, the Japanese would have to take it. MacArthur and his men held out for nearly 5 months against terrible odds and in terrible conditions. MacArthur was too valuable to be allowed to be taken prisoner, so he was snuck out of Bataan about a week or two before the position fell. He was ordered to Australia to organize the defenses of Australia against what was imagined would be a Japanese invasion. He left on a small boat and he vowed to the Filipinos and to the Americans, "I shall return." And that was MacArthur's vow. He would return to the Philippines in good time. After the Americans surrendered at Bataan and their final outpost of Corregidor, the Japanese, culturally, thought that people who surrendered were dishonorable and not quite human. And the Americans and the Filipinos who surrendered were treated absolutely horrendously by the Japanese conquerors. They were forced on what became known as the Bataan Death March. 15,000 Americans and 60,000 Filipino soldiers surrendered. And then they were led through the jungle for about 80 miles without food, without water for several days. Many of them died. Stragglers were shot. The suffering was terrible. And the general in charge got hanged for it after the war. That was the Bataan Death March. Go back to our map. The next move that the Japanese were going to try to make was to set up for an invasion of Australia. And they were going to start it by an invasion of Papua New Guinea. It's one of the most remote, backward places on Earth. There's still headhunting and cannibalism going on in New Guinea in 1941, 1942. But Japan suffers its first check at a naval battle called the Battle of the Coral Sea. And the Battle of the Coral Sea takes place here. And what happens in this battle, it's unique in the history of naval warfare. It's the first naval battle where the opposing ships do not see each other. And they do not see each other because the fighting is done by carrier-based aircraft. The Japanese were trying to clear the seas around Papua New Guinea and northern Australia so they could take over that island and then use it as a springboard to attack Australia. The Americans had no battleships left. They were all destroyed at Pearl Harbor. So the Americans send their aircraft carriers. For example, have a look at a World War II aircraft carrier. This is USS Lexington, one of the earliest American aircraft carriers. This is a picture of her from the 1930s. And in this Battle of the Coral Sea, the airplanes tried to sink the other side's aircraft carriers. And although the Battle of the Coral Sea was a draw, Lexington sank. This ship, this American aircraft carrier, was sunk at the Battle of the Coral Sea. One small Japanese carrier was sunk. But what it served to do, was stop the Japanese advance. That the Japanese could not control the seas around New Guinea, and because of that, they did not ever quite conquer the island. The Japanese did not lose the battle, but they no longer could invade the British Dominion of Australia. Japan's next goal was Midway Island. And if they took Midway Island, they could use Midway Island to threaten Hawaii. It's a great story. The Americans cracked the Japanese naval code. We learned through some really neat trickery that the Japanese were heading for Midway with these huge 4 fleet carriers. And the Americans, under the command of Bull Halsey, who actually missed the actual battle because he had a skin infection, but his subordinate fought this Battle of Midway, a naval battle around the island of Midway that would become the turning point of the entire Pacific War. And what happened at this battle, first of all, the United States are kind of using subpar aircraft. This is an F-4F. It cannot match the Zero in head-to-head combat. This is one of the reasons that the beginning of the war went so poorly for the United States. But the Battle of Midway was special in the annals of American military history. The aircraft carrier groups, the Americans found the Japanese first, and it's a great story. We don't have time to tell it in much detail. But there's 2 types of ways to sink an enemy aircraft carrier. There's dive bombing, where a bomber kind of flies high up over the aircraft carrier, dives on it, launches a single bomb, and then pulls out of the dive. And there's torpedo bombers, torpedo planes that kind of fly in low, launch torpedoes against these ships and fly away. This is a painting of a group of Avenger torpedo bombers attacking the Japanese carriers. And what happened was, these big, old, slow Avenger torpedo bombers came in low. All the Japanese fighter planes jumped on them, destroyed every single one of them. The entire force of these torpedo bombers was shot out of the sky. But in doing so, the dive bombers from up high were ignored by the Japanese fighters. And these American dive bombers kind of got closer and closer to the Japanese carriers. Were amazed to find that there was no fighter planes coming up to attack them because all the fighters had jumped on these poor Avenger torpedo bombers. Only one of the pilots of this entire fleet of planes survived. But the dive bombers got through, and the dive bombers destroyed 4 fleet carriers of the Japanese, to the loss of only 1 American aircraft carrier. It was the turning point of the entire Pacific War. What happened here was the Japanese will not be able to threaten Hawaii. They have lost the main striking force of their entire navy. But lots of land was still there to be reconquered. The distances in the Pacific theater were vast. So what the United States set about doing was it did what it called island hopping. That it would not try to take every single island held by the Japanese. It would bypass islands that were more heavily fortified, capture nearby islands, and just cut their supplies off. So for example, as we're going to see, this is kind of the easiest way to show it. The United States took back this island and this island, but ignored the other 3. That if the United States controlled the air and sea lanes around these islands, the Japanese could not reinforce their posts. And then maybe the United States would hop to this one, and then hop to that one, and this is known as island hopping. The first place where this took place, or the first place where this type of island hopping took place, was at the Battle of Guadalcanal, which is down around here, okay? That these islands are heavily fought for, the island of Guadalcanal and the Solomons. Months of heavy fighting end with U.S. control of the Solomons, and the main island in the Solomon Islands is called Guadalcanal. The Japanese finally evacuated. Oh shoot, this was 1943. I was wrong. Well, this is 1942 and 1943, people. We'll just connect that on the paper, won't we? In August of 1942, the Americans gained that position on Guadalcanal. The Japanese finally evacuate the Solomons in February of 1943. The Japanese lose 20,000 men to only 1,700 Americans. This battle on Guadalcanal served to puncture the myth that Western troops could not fight in the jungle. In fact, Western troops could fight in the jungle in some pretty terrible conditions. The Japanese like to attack at night. The Japanese like to, and the Marines who were on the island fought terribly, terribly hard to defend their positions against the Japanese. It punctured that myth that Western troops, Brits and Americans, could not fight in the jungle. They fought pretty well. And by the time 1943 is over, and the bell rings, by the time 1943 is over, Japan's advance has been halted. It's halted in India. It's halted at Midway. It's halted at the Coral Sea, at Guadalcanal, and now all that remains is for the Americans and the Brits to hop their way back towards the Japanese home island.